Thrown out at 20 years old, with nowhere to sleep and $11 sewn into her hem, Delphine Journet had already lost everything a young woman was supposed to have. Her uncle, Prosper Deal's cousin by marriage and the only guardian the law recognized after her father's death, had put her on the porch steps of the only home she'd ever known and told her, plainly, that a girl with no blood tie to the family had no claim to its roof. What little she carried out with her was a carpet bag, a sewing kit, and that thin fold of bills. 3 days later, standing in the dust outside the parish courthouse in Lucille, Louisiana, in the autumn of 1873, she watched the auctioneer wave off an entire plantation. 400 acres, a grand house gone gray with neglect, fields gone to broomsage, because not a single bidder in the crowd wanted a property folks whispered was cursed. She raised her hand and bought it for $2. Everyone around her laughed, or pitied her, or both. What none of them knew, what she herself could not yet imagine, was that sealed behind the walls of that ruined house lay a secret that would not only remake her own fortune, but return to an entire community something that had been stolen from it years before in the very silence of that same courthouse crowd. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Journet. If you're watching from a place that others have written off as worthless, tell us in the comments, because this story is for you. Delphine had been raised not in wealth, but in usefulness, which her father, Anton Journet, a leatherworker and saddler of modest reputation in the river town of Lucille, had always insisted was worth more. He was a widower by the time she was 6, her mother lost to fever, and he raised her alone above his little shop on Canal Street, teaching her, almost without meaning, to the two things that would define her life: how to work with her hands until a thing was made right, and how to keep an honest ledger. Anton was not a wealthy man, but he was a precise one. Every harness he sold, every boot he resold, every debt owed to him or by him was recorded in a slim black book he kept behind the counter, and by the time Delphine was 12, she was the one keeping it, her small, neat hand marching down the columns beside his larger, looser one. He used to tell her that a ledger was a kind of conscience you could hold in your palm, that numbers did not lie the way people sometimes did, and that a person who could read them clearly would never be entirely without power, even when they were without money. She did not know, then, how literally that lesson would one day save her. Her father was also a man who believed in mending things others had abandoned. It was a point of quiet pride with him that half his trade came from harnesses and saddles other craftsmen had declared beyond repair, cracked leather and broken buckles that he would soak in oil and stitch back into service, sometimes selling them for more than they'd cost new, simply because he had taken the time to see what was still good in them. Delphine grew up watching him turn scraps into a livelihood, watching customers who had written off some old piece of tack walk away astonished at what he'd coaxed back to life. It became, without either of them naming it as such, a kind of family religion. That value was not always visible on the surface. That ruin was sometimes only a costume worn over something worth saving. She would carry that belief through every hard year that came after, long after her father was gone, long after she had reason to doubt it. Anton also raised her, quietly and deliberately, to notice the people around her whom the town had already decided not to notice. Lucille, like most towns along that stretch of the river, had been reshaped hard by the war and by the years since, and there were families scattered along its edges, freedmen and freedwomen who had once worked the great plantations upriver and now scraped a living on rented plots or by day labor. Families the shopkeepers on Canal Street served through the back door, if they served them at all. Anton served everyone through the front, and he taught Delphine to do the same, not as charity, but as plain fairness. And among the customers who came to trust the Journet shop was a soft-spoken, broad-shouldered man named Isaiah Freeman, once enslaved on a grand estate called Bellefontaine, some 6 miles upriver, now trying to build a life for his wife and children on a rented corner of land he did not own and could not seem to save enough to buy. Isaiah and Anton became something like friends over the years, two careful men who respected each other's hands, and Delphine, still a girl, absorbed from watching them the understanding that dignity and poverty could live in the same body, and that a person's worth was never decided by what the town said about them. When Anton Journet died of a fever in the spring of 1873, 2 months shy of Delphine's 20th birthday, the shop and the small house above it passed, by the tangled logic of the law and a will that had never been properly witnessed, not to his daughter, but to his late wife's cousin, Aline. Watchful man named Prosper Deal, who had drifted into Lucille some years before and built himself a modest but growing reputation as a lawyer willing to handle the estates other men found too troublesome or too thin to bother with. Deal arrived within a week of the funeral, papers in hand, and explained to Delphine, not unkindly on the surface, but with a coldness underneath that she would only later understand, that because she was no blood relation to her stepmother's family, and because her father's will could not be proven in court, the property was legally his to administer, and that the kindest thing he could do for her was give her a small sum to start elsewhere. He handed her $11, the value he had decided her 20 years in that house and shop were worth, and told her the shop would be sold within the month. She left with her carpet bag and her sewing kit and the $11 folded into the hem of her one good dress. And for 3 days she stayed in the spare room of a widow named Odile Beaumont, who took pity on her, mending clothes to earn her keep and turning over in her mind, again and again, the unfairness of a system that could take a life's work and hand it to a stranger, simply because the stranger knew the right words to say in a courthouse. It was during those 3 days, sitting on Odile's porch with her ledger habits still alive in her fingers, even with nothing left to record, that she heard the courthouse crier announcing a tax sale, properties forfeited for unpaid assessments to be auctioned that Saturday, and among the names read aloud, almost as an afterthought, was Bellefontaine. Bellefontaine had once been among the grandest estates on that stretch of river, 400 acres of cotton land anchored by a 2-story house with tall columns and a wide gallery, built by a family whose fortune had risen and fallen with the very system that built it. Its last owner, Colonel Aurelius Bellefontaine, had died in the final year of the war, and in the chaos of reconstruction that followed, the estate had drifted into a strange, unclaimed limbo. There were rumors of a will never found, rumors of debts, rumors that the house itself was unlucky, that lights moved in its windows at night, and that anyone who tried to farm the land again found their crops failing without explanation. Whatever the truth of the rumors, the plain fact was that no distant Bellefontaine heir had ever come to claim it. The taxes had gone unpaid for 8 years running, and on the Saturday of the sale, when the auctioneer called for bids on the whole property, house, outbuildings, and land together, the crowd shuffled and murmured and looked at their boots, and not one man raised his hand. Delphine stood at the back of that crowd with Odile Beaumont beside her, watching grown men who would not think twice about buying a haunted house's worth of firewood refuse to touch the deed to an entire plantation. And something in her, some stubborn inheritance from her father's habit of seeing worth where others saw ruin, rose up before she had fully decided to let it. When the auctioneer, half joking, asked if anyone would take it for $2 just to close the sale and be done with it, she heard her own voice answer before her good sense could stop her. The crowd laughed, not cruelly, but with the particular pity reserved for the desperate and the foolish, and Prosper Deal, who happened to be standing near the courthouse steps that morning on unrelated business, turned his head at the sound of her voice and watched her sign the paper with an expression she would not fully understand until much later, an expression that was not amusement at all, but something closer to alarm. She rode out to Bellefontaine 3 days later in the back of Farmer's wagon, having paid the driver with mending work rather than coin, and the sight of the house as it came into view through the overgrown allée of oaks struck her with a feeling she had not expected, not fear, but a kind of recognition, as though she were looking at a larger, sadder version of her father's shop, a thing gone to ruin that still held, somewhere in its bones, the shape of what it had been. The columns were gray and peeling, the gallery sagging at one corner, the windows either broken or boarded, and the fields beyond had gone entirely to broomsage and young pine. But the house stood, stubborn and whole enough, and Delphine, standing in the weed-choked drive with her carpet-bag in one hand, felt something her father would have recognized instantly, the itch to see what could still be saved. She spent her first days there simply making the house livable enough to sleep in, sweeping out one downstairs room, boarding a broken window pane with a shutter she pried loose from another, drawing water from a well that still, thankfully, ran clean. It was on the fourth evening, while running her hand along the wall of what had clearly once been the Colonel's study, searching for a stud to hang a shelf, that her fingers caught on a seam in the paneling that did not match the grain around it. A seam too straight, too deliberate, to be the work of age or damage. She worked at it with a kitchen knife for the better part of an hour before a section of the wall, no wider than a door, gave way on a set of hidden hinges and swung inward to reveal a shallow recess built into the wall itself. And inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, a strongbox and a bundle of papers tied with wax cord. Her hands shook as she carried them out into the last of the daylight on the gallery, and what she found inside, in the failing light of that first evening, was not gold, not yet, but something that would prove, in time, to matter far more. The bundle held letters, dozens of them, written in a careful, educated hand she would come to know as Colonel Aurelius Bellefontain's own, along with a document folded separately from the rest, sealed with wax and marked, in that same hand, as his last will and testament. She did not understand that first night the full weight of what she held. She understood only that a man long dead had gone to great trouble to hide these papers where no casual searcher would find them, and that a house the whole parish believed cursed and empty had, in fact, been keeping a secret for 8 patient years. It took her the better part of 2 weeks, working by lamplight after long days spent making the house merely habitable, to piece together the story the letters told, and what emerged from them was unlike anything she had imagined. Colonel Bellefontaine, it seemed, had spent the final years of the war in a slow and evidently genuine reckoning with the foundations of the life he had built, a reckoning hastened by the deaths of 2 sons in battles that had gained nothing, and by long conversations, recorded in his own letters to a cousin in New Orleans, with the very people his family had once enslaved, among them a young man named Isaiah Freeman, whom the Colonel described, with what read as real respect, as the only man on the place whose judgment he trusted more than his own. In the last winter of his life, weakened by the illness that would kill him before the war's end, the Colonel had drawn up a will, the very document Delphine now held, that divided the bulk of Bellefontaine's 400 acres into parcels to be deeded outright to the freed families who had worked the land, along with a sum of gold, hidden somewhere on the property for safekeeping against the chaos he correctly predicted would follow the war, meant to help those families establish themselves as independent farmers rather than tenants bound by debt to their former owners. The will had never been executed. The letters made clear why. In the final months of his life, Aurelius Bellefontaine had entrusted the will's safekeeping and eventual filing to a young lawyer he had recently taken on to manage the estate's tangled affairs, a sharp, ambitious man new to the parish who had impressed him with his diligence, a man named Prosper Deal. The last letter in the bundle, dated only weeks before the Colonel's death, expressed a flicker of unease about that trust, a note that Deal had begun asking pointed questions about the extent and location of the estate's remaining assets, and the Colonel's decision, evidently made in haste and secrecy, to hide the will and the strongbox himself in the wall of his own study, rather than leave them in his lawyer's keeping, trusting that his cousin or a future filing would set things right. He had died before he could act further, and in the years since, Delphine now understood with a cold, sinking clarity, Prosper Deal had built his entire standing in Lucille on an estate whose true final wishes he had likely suspected and quietly buried, letting the plantation rot into rumor and ruin, letting the freedmen who should have inherited it drift into rented poverty on its edges, while he waited, patient as rust, for the day the land could be acquired cheaply and without questions by someone with the right connections in the courthouse. She sat with that understanding for a long time on the gallery steps, the papers in her lap, the crickets loud in the dark fields beyond, and felt the shape of her own recent history rearrange itself around a single, bitter recognition. The man who had put her out on the street with $11, who had stood at the courthouse steps the day she bought this land for $2, was the same man who had spent 8 years making sure no one else discovered what she now held in her hands. She did not act rashly. Her father's ledgers had taught her that much, that the worth of a discovery lay not in shouting it, but in proving it, carefully, in a form no court could dismiss. She spent the following weeks in a kind of quiet, disciplined fever, cross-referencing the letters against parish records at the courthouse, where a sympathetic young clerk named Thaddeus, or who remembered her father fondly, allowed her to examine old tax filings and land surveys without asking too many questions about why. She rode out, too, to the rented plot where Isaiah Freeman still lived with his wife Ruth and their 3 children, and sat with them at their table and read aloud, in her father's own careful, steady voice she had learned from him, the words the colonel had written about a man he trusted more than his own judgment. Isaiah wept, quietly, the first time he heard it. Not from surprise, he said, because he had always suspected some promise had been made and broken, but from the strange grief of learning, 8 years too late, that it had been right to hope. Word of what Delphine had found could not stay contained in a parish as small as Lucille, and it reached Prosper Deal within a month, likely through the same clerk's office she had used, or through the wagon driver, or through a dozen other threads that wove through so small a town. He came to Bellefontaine himself on a gray afternoon in early winter, riding up the overgrown allée in a good coat, and found her on the gallery with the strong-box papers spread on a table before her. And for a moment his composure slipped entirely before he caught it again and reassembled his lawyer's face. He told her, with the careful, reasonable tone of a man used to being believed, that whatever papers she had found were almost certainly forgeries or drafts never properly executed, that she was a young woman out of her depth playing with documents she did not understand, and that the wisest course for her own protection would be to sell him the property back, quietly, for a fair sum above what she'd paid, and let the whole unfortunate business rest. She told him, in the same steady voice she had used to read the colonel's letters aloud at Isaiah's table, that she would be filing the will with the parish court the following week, and that she trusted the judge to determine, properly and in the open, whether it was genuine. Deal's reasonable tone did not survive that answer. He warned her, more plainly this time, that a woman with no family standing in Lucille, a woman the town already whispered about for buying a cursed house for $2, would find it very difficult to be believed against a respected officer of the court, that reputations were not built on paper alone, but on who a community chose to trust, and that she would do well to remember which of them the town had known longer. The weeks that followed tested that warning in earnest. Deal, moving quickly and quietly through channels she could not match, spread word through the parish that the girl at Bellefontaine was attempting a fraud on the estate, that she had likely forged the will herself, perhaps with help, to justify claiming land far beyond what her $2 had bought, and that decent people ought to be wary of dealing with her. 2 farmers who had agreed to help her clear a field for planting quietly withdrew their offer. The general store on Canal Street, when she went to buy nails, kept her waiting an unusually long time before serving her. Even Odile Beaumont, loyal as she'd been, admitted with worried eyes that folks were talking, and that a young woman alone, without family, could not afford too many enemies in a small parish. Delphine felt, in those weeks, the particular loneliness of being disbelieved, the same cold isolation she had felt on her uncle's porch, and there were nights she sat on the gallery steps and wondered whether her father's faith in ledgers and honest proof was simply not enough against a man who understood, far better than she did, how a town's trust could be quietly bent. What turned the tide was not a single dramatic confrontation, but the accumulation of the very patience her father had taught her. Thaddeus, or the clerk, quietly helped her locate the original tax assessment records from the year of the colonel's death, records that showed Deal himself had filed the paperwork declaring the estate to have died intestate, with no will found, a filing that now sat in stark contradiction to the sealed, dated will in her possession, whose wax seal an examining judge would later confirm bore markings consistent with a stamp the colonel was known to have used in the last year of his life. Isaiah Freeman, for his part, brought forward 2 other former Bellefontaine workers, an elderly woman named Celestine and a man named Obadiah, who both recalled, independently and without having spoken to each other beforehand, Conversations in the last winter of the war, in which the colonel had told them plainly that land would be theirs when the fighting ended. Conversations that matched, detail for detail, sentiments expressed in the colonel's letters. And Delphine herself, walking the grounds with a description drawn from one of the letters that spoke of gold buried near the old smokehouse, beneath the second stone from the door, found, after an afternoon of careful digging, a second strongbox containing coin and a small quantity of gold, exactly where the letter said it would be, evidence that could not plausibly have been planted by a forger who did not know the ground itself. The case came before Judge Eloy Marchand in the Lucille courthouse on a cold morning in January, and the room was fuller than any Delphine had seen since her father's funeral, filled with farmers curious about the girl and the curse, and the courthouse gossip, filled, too, in the back rows, with Isaiah and Ruth Freeman and a dozen other families who had once called Belle Fountain home in a different sense of the word. Deal argued smoothly, as he always did, casting doubt on the will's provenance, suggesting collusion between Delphine and the witnesses, reminding the judge of her age, her lack of standing, her convenient discovery of a fortune days after purchasing the land for almost nothing. But the weight of what she had assembled, the matching wax seal, the corroborating testimonies gathered independently, the tax filing that placed Deal's own signature at the center of what he claimed never existed, the gold found exactly where a dead man's letter said it would be, proved more than his smooth reasonableness could turn aside. Judge Marchand, after 2 days of testimony, ruled the will authentic and its instructions binding, ordered the parcels of land deeded as the colonel had intended, to Isaiah Freeman and 11 other families named or clearly implied within the letters, and referred the matter of Prosper Deal's original filing to the State Bar for investigation, a process that would end, within the year, in his quiet disbarment and his departure from Lucille altogether, not driven out with violence or spectacle, but simply and thoroughly stripped of the standing he had spent years building on a foundation of suppressed truth. Delphine herself retained, by the will's own terms, the house and a portion of the land immediately surrounding it, along with a share of the recovered gold that the colonel had specifically designated for whoever ultimately brought his true wishes to light, a share she could, by any honest measure, have kept entirely for herself and lived comfortably the rest of her days, having lost everything once already and having earned, by any fair account, the right to think of herself first. She did not choose that path. In the months that followed the ruling, she used her portion of the gold, together with what income the restored land began to generate, to rebuild the old plantation schoolhouse that had stood empty since the war, hiring a teacher for the children of the newly deeded families and her own future children alike, and to help finance a small church the community had long wanted but never had the means to build and to establish, on a corner of her own retained land, a workshop not unlike her father's, where she took on 2 young apprentices, one of them Isaiah and Ruth's eldest daughter, and taught them the same lesson her father had taught her, that a ledger was a kind of conscience, and that things others called ruined were very often only waiting for someone patient enough to see what remained good in them. It is worth returning, now, to where this story began, to a 20-year-old woman standing in a courthouse crowd with $11 in her hem, watching grown men refuse to bid on a house the whole parish had decided was cursed and worthless. What Delphine Journet understood that morning, without fully knowing she understood it, was something her father had spent her whole childhood teaching her without ever saying it in so many words, that the world is very quick to declare a thing beyond saving, and very often wrong. The plantation she bought for $2 was not cursed at all, only abandoned by a town too eager to look away from its own unfinished business, its own broken promise to the people who had built it. And Delphine, a girl the same town had also been quick to look away from, turned out to be exactly the kind of overlooked, undervalued thing capable of setting it right. The house that had frightened away every other bidder became, under her hand, a schoolhouse's neighbor and a church's benefactor, and the quiet center of a community finally given what had been promised to it years before. She had lost her home once to a man who mistook legal cleverness for justice, and she used that same loss, transformed by patience and honest work, to give an entire community back its own. Thank you for spending this time with Delphine's story. And if it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that worth is not always visible on the surface. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something the world around you had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.